Welcome, everybody. Hello, thank you. I'm Roger Berkowitz, the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here. This is the first Tough Talk of the semester, these are always exciting events, and I'm thrilled to have you here. I'm going to let the head of the Tough Talks introduce tonight's event, but just one or two words about the Tough Talks. This is a great series that's been going on for about a year and a half now, and it really is designed to bring people to Bard who's, for whatever reason, are thought to be by the people who run it, the Tough Talk series. It's a student-run series. Something that will be challenging and maybe outside of the everyday opinion of Bard College students and faculty and the community, and to try and get us to think and engage in a conversation that will provoke us and challenge us. And it's become one of the most popular series we do, and we're really thrilled that it will be continuing. Our head of Tough Talks and founder of it, I guess, is Mark Williams. He came to me 2 years ago with this idea, and I'm thrilled that he's been able to put it together. This is his last semester running it, and we are looking for people to help keep it going. So if you're interested, feel free to come talk to him or me about that. I want to thank Mark for 2 years of running the series. It's been a real pleasure working with you, and you've done a great job. And I'd like to introduce Mark Williams, who will now introduce tonight's program. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Roger, for your kind words. And just a kind of disclaimer, if anybody really wants to run the Tough Talk lecture series or wants to get involved, you really need thick skin. Just gonna put that out there. This is not for the weak. So tonight, we have Dana Francesco Miranda, who is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut Stores. And Dana actually is an alum of Bard College. He earned his bachelor's degree here in 2014. And one of the things that Bard is really good at is taking care of its alumni. And so Dana, I actually have a present for you from the Alumni Development Office.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Woo. So yeah, if anybody ever comes back to talk, you get a nice gift. His research is in political philosophy, Africana philosophy, and 19th century and contemporary European thought. His current work investigates the philosophical significance of suicide, depression, and well-being for members of the African diaspora. He currently serves as the Secretary of Graduate Outreach and Chair of Architectonics for the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and is a Connecticut Civic Ambassador. Dana will be in conversation with Professor Curry once Professor Curry finishes his lecture, and then afterwards it'll be opened up to Q&A. Our speaker for tonight is Dr. Tommy J. Curry, who is a professor of philosophy and Africana studies at Texas A&M University, where he held the prestigious Ray A. Rothrock Fellowship from 2013 to 2016, and was the USC Shoah Foundation's 2016 to 2017 AI and Magna Chep Foundation Teaching Fellow. Dr. Curry is the current president of Philosophy Born of Struggle, one of the oldest Black philosophy organizations in the country. He is the author of over 60 articles and book chapters on racism, critical race theory, hip-hop, and Black male vulnerability. His public commentaries on topics ranging from hip-hop to the death and rape of Black men and boys, to regenerative stem cell treatments, which have appeared in venues such as Forbes, The Chronicle, Salon, PBS, The Hill, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and SiriusXM, have recently been recognized by the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy's Alan Locke Award for Public Philosophy. Dr. Curry is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, which recently came out in 2017. Fall of 2017. And it analyzes the sexual and erotic drives behind Black male death and rape. And he's also the author of Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a White Racial Empire, and editor of the philosophical treatise of William H. Ferris, Selected Readings from the African Abroad, or His Evolution in Western Civilization. He is currently co-editing the forthcoming anthology, Contemporary African American Philosophy, Where Do We Go From Here?, which will be available for you to buy in 2019. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome to Bard College tonight, Dr. Tommy J. Curry.
Thank you so much, sir. So first, thank everyone for showing up. This is far too cold for me. I hibernate in cold weather. I don't like it. I'm Southern. But thanks so much to the center, to Mr. Williams, to everyone involved for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk to you about something that is, speaking to my right, that is somewhat controversial. It's about the history of feminism. And we take feminism today to be an almost obvious and intuitive movement, something that doesn't really have a history. It stands in for how we think about equality. And we suggest that it has a position as a value that's foremost and much more progressive than any other values in our society. So what I'm going to do today is talk about feminism not as a movement, but a backlash against black male emancipation. And there's a lot of things about feminism that we just don't know, that we don't study, because we take a kind of pop culture orientation to it and we devoid it from its actual historical situation and context. So quite often, the more popular an idea becomes, the harder it is to question the rise of that idea. So introducing skepticism or questioning the propagandist aspects of what has become a cherished ideal, a belief or thought to be obvious or intuitively correct, is often seen as heresy. Feminism has become such an idea. Over the last several decades, the history of white women's rights movement as its leaders have become increasingly described as not only influenced by racism, but intimately committed to the preservation and imperial projection of white supremacy. For example, the historian Louise Newman has argued that, quote, racism was not just an unfortunate sideshow in the performance of feminist theory. Rather, it was center stage, an integral, constitutive element in feminism's overall understanding of citizenship, democracy, political self-possession, and equality. Rather than being a generative critique of the racist legacy, suffragists, segregationists, and the competing political ideologies of 20th century America, much of the interpretive favor given to the racism of American feminism has focused on the historical failure of integrating black women into the feminist movement and the contemporary absence of intersectionality amongst white women. The explanation of feminism's failures have been articulated as failures of inclusion, the exclusion of black women. Little to no research has evaluated the cost of feminism's racist caricatures and political appeal to white supremacy to black men. The previous research by historian Michelle Mitchell, specifically her article entitled Lower Orders, Racial Hierarchies and Race Rhetoric, Evolutionary Echoes in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Thought During the Late 1860s, is exceptional in showing that the dangerous racialist thinking of white suffragists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton redefined the movement. Mitchell does not see Stanton's ideas as blameworthy, however, right? Because Mitchell doesn't want to see Stanton as fundamentally connected to the kind of discrimination that happened in the late 19th and mid 20th century. The violence of feminism, its pursuits of imperialism, its violence and criminalization of black men and other racialized males, its demand for segregationist logics to protect womanhood, have not been properly pursued by black theorists in such a way that has become part of the dominant historiography, despite black males being the group specifically targeted by white suffragettes during the debates over the 15th Amendment and by women's rights groups who feared engaging a public field of free black men who they thought were rapists. These ideas not only mirrored the ethnological thinking of the day, but sought to advance such racial theories as public opinion and social consciousness on the matters were not only tied to race, but racial manhood. If scholars accept, as they often do, that 19th century feminism was a transformative movement that changed the social consciousness of its day, then we must also accept that its racism was not solely isolated to the minds of its architects and leaders. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a racist. She believed wholeheartedly that white women were more evolved than blacks and more developed and civilized than black men. And this is fundamentally important because in 19th century ethnology, the way that we understand gender was not exactly the way we understand it in the 21st century. In the 19th century, genders did not talk about bodies. They were characteristics of races. So when you talk about a patriarchal race or patriarchy, you're in fact actually talking about one race, whites. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is advancing an argument that suggests that she is more civilized, more developed, hierarchically developed than black people. And that meant that she was in fact more patriarchal than black people, even black men. As Corin T. Field writes in Struggles for Equal Adulthood, quote, Stanton did all she could to convince Republican leaders that adulthood rather than manhood should determine political rights. To press her argument, she made a fateful choice. She decided to attack the political capacity of adult men by invoking scientific and popular theories of racial difference. The highlighting of Stanton's beliefs should not distract the reader from the larger point concerning the specific ethnological theories, the racism, and the particularly misandric and dangerous views concerning the existence of racialized men as citizens with political rights. One must not be distracted by the historical context of this particular work. So this is not a conversation just about how they were racist. It's a question of how the movement itself utilized racism, what we would take today to be stereotypes about black men, scientific theories about the maturation of black men, such when they hit puberty, they don't become men, they become rapists. These were the popular ethnological theories of the mid-19th century. And these were utilized not just by Stanton, but by other suffragettes in their propaganda to show that white women were in fact more superior, safer, and necessary to development of Western society. So what I will argue is that it's essential to understand the racialist discourse and political theories of 19th and 20th century feminism as a backlash against the enfranchisement of black men and the occupying of America with racialized male bodies. Understanding feminism as a backlash is a necessary paradigmatic intervention into current historiographic accounts of women's rights. While there has been a swell of substantial work looking at the political ideology, imperial justifications, and racial reactions of white women to black enfranchisements, there's been no engagement with the positionality of black men, and both black and male, and their position is both black and male in relation to the coalescence of white power and white imperial ventures on present interpretations of suffrage and feminism trajectory into the 20th century. Using the term racial backlash to describe feminism, I mean to convey a deliberate and dedicated program of action by a dominant group, in this case white women, who along with various white supremacist entities sought to eradicate the perceived gains of suffrage and citizenship for blacks through the criminalization of black men. Similar to well-established conceptualizations of racial backlash, as, quote, a forceful swing against the perceived unwelcome change of the status quo, indicated by a strong adverse reaction against various racial remedies adopted by national governments for the effects of century-long discrimination, this has not been applied to feminism. While it's routinely acknowledged that racial or white backlashes accompany every racial advance from slavery to our post-Obama America, feminism's shift from universal suffrage to educated racialized suffrage rights remains unaccounted for by the literature. So what I want to do is actually trace the construction of the black brute, the black male rapist, and his disposability within the discourse of American suffragism and Jim Crow. While it's often said that feminism is not anti-male, what I in fact aim to prove is that feminism was certainly and undoubtedly anti-black male. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was ratified December 6, 1865. By December 26th of that year, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had already sent a petition to the House of Representatives and the Senate floor demanding the enfranchisement of all women in the United States as a class. Stanton was adamant that white women were the rightful inheritors of the right to vote. She explicitly appealed to the nativist sentiments of many 19th century statements when she called their attention to the fact that there were 15 million intelligent, virtuous, native-born American citizens who were now the only class who stand outside of the pale of political recognition. The appeal to the native-born and virtuous character of white women not only positioned their place alongside white men and as Americans, but highlighted the egregious harm done to white women as disenfranchised citizens. This term dislocated the recently granted citizenship of black men who had aspirations for suffrage by reminding the representatives of the state that all blacks are alien, not native and emancipated slaves, not citizens. In fact, black people had not been granted citizenship for more than 20 days when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other suffragists began circulating petitions calling for black men to be refused the right to the ballot. Now, contrary to many intuitive accounts of the debates concerning suffrage, black men were thrown into a horrid defense of their humanity, their manhood, and their ability to resist alleged savageness unleashed with the dissolution of slavery. And this is so important When we often think about the relationships that black men had to suffrage, to women's rights, there's an intuition where we said they're men so they were privileged. We don't learn about the contestation involved. We don't learn about the battles or the demonizations involved. We just assume that somehow they escaped, they got freed from slavery, and automatically citizenship and the right to vote were handed to them. Nothing could actually be farther from the truth. In an 1860 article entitled Unity of the Human Race Disproved by the Hebrew Bible, Samuel Cartwright expressed his wholehearted belief that the Negro man was created as a beast that ruined Eve. Making a careful distinction between the Hebrew and English translations of the 21st verse in the first chapter of Genesis, Cartwright concludes that God created a beast of the earth different in kind from that of Adam, who was a, quote, superior race of Nephet. Cartwright believed that God made an inferior man who was the slave of the devil. Interpreting the findings of the biblical commentator Adam Clarke, Cartwright writes, "The creature which beguiled Eve was an animal formed like a man, walked erect, and had the gift of speech and reason. He believed it was an orangutan and not a serpent. If he had lived in Louisiana instead of England, he would have recognized the Negro gardener." End quote. In the years preceding the end of the Civil War, white ethnologists sought to convey to the American public the dangers of an unshackled black male and reclaim what was meant by the use of the word man. Cartwright insisted that the Jeffersonian use of this word in the Declaration of Independence was Hebraic, referring only to the Adamite race and its descendants. He says, quote, "For 1,500 years, the Adamic race had appropriated the term man and mankind exclusively to itself. During these 1,500 years, whenever we see the term man in our English translation, we will find Adam in Hebrew. Mr. Jefferson used the term men in the Declaration of Independence in its original Hebrew sense," wrote Cartwright. "The Negro was a natural slave, the best slave, not a man. His enslavement would require no military force to keep him in subjugation, no prisons to hold him, or chains to bind him," according to Cartwright. In his 1861 book, Negroes and Negro Slavery, the first an inferior race, the latter its normal condition, John Van Every continued the great efforts of ethnologists that assured the world that the Negro race, as indicated by a careful study of its male sex, was meant for servitude. Like Cartwright, who wrote that Negroes are all knee benders, literally and metaphorically, knee benders in mind and body, John Every also noted that manhood was anatomically unattainable for the Negro male. "The Negro," writes Van Every, "is incapable of an erect or direct perpendicular posture. The tout ensemble of the anatomical formation forbids an erect posture." Van Every believed the white man represented the perfect masculine form of all the races. He writes that, quote, "The form or figure of the Caucasian is perfectly erect, with the eyes on the plane with the horizon, and the broad forehead, distinct features, and full and flowing beard stamp him with the superiority and even majesty denied all other creatures, and relative to all other races of men. The narrow and longitudinal head of the Negro projecting posteriorly places his eyes at an angle with the horizon, and thus alone enables him to approximate to an erect position. The black man could not cast his eyes to the heaven and stand as a man. He was condemned by his inferior position to bow to all in nature, most notably to white men." Posture and color were not the sole or even the most important features that indicated manhood and the civilizational maturation of the race for Van Every. That honor belonged to the beard. The Caucasian alone has a beard. I didn't make this up, I promise people. For though all others approximate to its respect, it is the only bearded race. And some writers on ethnology have been so impressed with this imposing and striking distinction that they have sought to make it the basis of a classification of the races. And there is certainly no physical or outward quality that is so imposingly impresses itself on the senses as a mark of superiority, of evidence of supremacy, as a full and flowing beard. The beard was a mark of the ethnological order, the evidence of superior place. The white masculine race was afforded the civilizational design of superiority by the divine. Van Every believed that the social status of man, the social political character of manhood that configured the hierarchy of the citizen, belonged solely to white men. The black male was not a man. The intellect, The mental strength, the moral beauty, all of the qualities of the inner being, as well as those outward attributes tangible to the sense, harmonize perfectly in the growth of the beard. And when that has reached its full development, it is both the signal and proof of a mature manhood, the exact ad measurement and absolute proof of the maturity of the individual, as well as the type and standard of the race. This is equally true when applied to different races. The Caucasian is the only bearded race, but all others approximate in this respect, and the Negro is farthest removed of all. For the tropical woolly-haired African or Negro, except for a little tuft of hair on the chin and sometimes the upper lip, he has nothing that can be confounded with a beard. Now, Every's ethnological schema was not altogether novel during the Civil War. As the historian Melissa Stein explains, quote, secondary sex characteristics like body and facial hair were of keen interest to white scientists during and after the Civil War. The need to verify the manhood of black men during the Civil War was of such dire concern that in 1863, the Union Army commissioned the Sanitary Commission to measure, quote, the most important physical dimensions and personal characteristics of the diverse body of males who their work afforded access. Physicians were instructed to, quote, observe the colored troopers when unclothed and record their pilosity on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 representing the maximum which he had ever seen or should see in a white man. Now, this is what's fun, right? Like we're seeing a history of the sexual exploitation and eroticization of black men. We don't usually hear about that. We don't see how racist theories sexualize men as lesser men and how they studied bodies, looked at them naked. There's also studies where they penetrated them, where they were measuring erect. All these things involve the sexualization of the male character, the male body, the male phallus. But this escapes us when we think about how black men were actually engaging with the term man and what kind of obstacles would be presented before them when they try to actually claim manhood. While some may think the various ethnological configurations of race during the 19th century are merely historical descriptors of a long gone era, decadent pseudoscience, I would urge you to see how this configures the larger question of humanity. These ideas concerning race and manhood were being deployed in various discourses and political appeals by white scientists and suffragists alike. Black men were ethnologically excluded from the order of man, the idea of the human. They were sexed as male, but did not possess a gender or anything that could resemble masculinity. Gender, the distinct roles enacted by men and women, only belonged to the white race. Blacks and other savage races simply had not yet evolved to a stage of civilization as to be designated by anything other than sex. The savages were far too sexually egalitarian to be civilized. Gender required, or more accurately mandated by the law of nature, sexual inegalitarian relationships between men and women. Cynthia Eagle Russett describes this relationship as one of complementarianism, not competitiveness, whereby, quote, each sex had a distinctive function for which it was best suited. Neither could prosper alone, and social harmony as well as social progress were best served when the boundaries that separated their respective domains were observed. Female superiority of the sexes were marks of youth in the white race and permanent designations of inferiority in the savage races. As Gail Biederman explains, one could identify advanced civilizations by the degree of their sexual differentiation. Savage, that is non-white, men and women were believed to be the most identical, but men and women of the civilized races had evolved pronounced sexual differences. To be similar to each other was to introduce primitivity and savage femininity to a patriarchal race of white men and women. So then what did freedom do? Freedom enabled black men and women to make claims about womanhood and manhood. But don't make the mistake of thinking that feminism was in fact about equality. The ethnological scheme of the time suggested that white women, in order to gain power, had to complement white men. They could not overthrow them. They could not overturn them. And the language that they used in the revolution in the 1860s was not about equality. Equality is never mentioned within the pages of the revolution when they're talking about white men. It was about unity, racial superiority, and preserving the white republic. So when Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to abandon the plight of blacks and side with Democrats, under the leadership of pro-slavery advocate George Francis Train, she made a deliberate and calculated decision to demonize black men as threats to womanhood and exclude black women from the ballot through through the use of educated suffrage. By 1867, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had begun advocating for educated suffrage, a position that would be adopted as part of the National Women's Suffrage Association actual platform in 1903. Educated suffrage was a damaging discourse aimed at convincing a racial American public that black women were too uneducated and ignorant to desire the ballot. As historian Rosalind Turgborg Penn explains, quote, "The educated suffrage argument was elitist because advocates believed that a majority of foreign-born, poor, and African-American women would be excluded from the franchise. Consistent with the discriminatory nature of this woman's suffrage view, the majority of white middle-class suffragists abandoned the 20th century cry for universal suffrage. As a result of the racism inherent in this position, the policies of the national women's suffrage leaders during the 20th century either justified the enfranchisement of white women only or took a states' right position, which in essence would have excluded black women in much of the South," end quote. Black women were excluded while black men were being constructed as political threats. The actions of Stanton were remarkably consistent with the theories of racial inferiority held by George Francis Train. So for those who do not know, back then, Republicans were actually against slavery, but Democrats weren't. So when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other suffragists or suffragettes saw that they could not get the right to vote, that the anti-suffrage movement in their own race was putting the conversation and discourse of black men first, they decided to switch sides. They joined the Democratic Party. Now, why is that important? Because this white Irishman, James Francis Train, believed that black people should still be enslaved. George Francis Train funded the revolution. He funded the pro-women's rights, pro-suffrage canon or organ that we cite today as being the epitome of the activism for women's rights. Train clearly articulated his views on innate inferiority and immorality of the African race. He says, "The African has no social ties, no sacred rights, no family pleasures, and is a cannibal." Slavery was good for the African because it brought him to church to God. And since Africa had no Christian ministers or school teachers, there was no way to expect improvement or development. The ignorance of the African had therefore become genetic. Train was adamant that, quote, "Religiously and morally, all the heads under which I've classified the arguments are subordinate to this. The barbarian meets civilized man and improves as far as he can. Education may develop, but cannot originate mind. Color is not the only thing that marks him. You must first put inside his thick skull 9 cubic inches of more brain." So far as America is concerned, slavery, if not a curse to the white man, is compared to his native habits, a blessing to the slave. America is no more a hell to the Negro than Africa is a heaven. So while you have historians like Louise Newman, Paula Giddings, Sue Davis, etc., that have already pointed out the racism of the revolution, of suffragists, etc., and the relationship with George Francis Train, what we have continued to miss is the way in which feminists in the 19th century constructed the idea of masculinity and manhood. On the one hand, the idea of manhood was not oppressive. White manhood was actually a civilizing force. Racialized manhood, the manhood of lower orders, is what became the problem. So in manhood suffrage, Stanton does object to what she perceives as the tendencies of male government, tendencies that have come in our present day to become synonymous and understood with patriarchy. Stanton believes that the male element is a destructive force, stern, selfish, aggrandizing, loving war, violence, conquest, accusation, breeding discord, disorder, disease, and death. Slavery and war, according to Stanton, emerged because of the excess of the masculine element. So Stanton was interested in the balance that white womanhood had to white manhood. She writes, "Mid violence and disturbance in the natural world, we see a constant effort to maintain an equilibrium of forces. Nature, like a loving mother, is ever trying to keep land and sea, mountain and valley, each in their place. To hush the angry wave and winds, balance the extremes of heat and cold, of rain and drought, that harmony and beauty may reign supreme. There is ever a striking analogy in the world of matter and mind, and the present disorganization of our social state warns us that in the dethronement of woman, we have lots to lose in the elements of violence and ruin that she only has the power to curb. If civilization of the age calls for an extension of suffrage, says Stadden, a government of the most virtuous, educated men and women would better represent the whole humanitarian idea. Airily absent from Stadden's urging for suffrage is a call for equality. Stadden is reminding her readers that, quote, a man's government is much worse and more unjust than a white man's government, because in proportion as you multiply the tyrants, you make the condition of the subjects more hopeless and degraded. Stadden is not arguing against white man's government, or what we would now understand as patriarchy. She is against being ruled by men of the darker races, men with a degraded and inferior manhood. She argues this throughout her reflections on male suffrage. She says, quote, if woman finds it hard to bear the oppressive laws of a few Saxon fathers, or the best orders of manhood, what may she not be called to endure when all the lower orders, natives and foreigners, Dutch, Irish, Chinese, and African legislate for her daughters? So when Stadden asks readers to think of Patrick and Sambo, of Hans and Young Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy or republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lydia Childs, Lucretia Mott, or Fanny Keble, she is asking them to imagine superior and educated white women being ruled by savage men, who possesses much more and more severe brutish natures. Empowering savage males politically was against the law of science. Stadden had argued that all late writers on science of government recognized in woman the great humanizing element of the new era we are now entering, in which moral power is to govern brute force. So the lower orders of men were constructed by Stadden to be threats to womanhood. They were not fit to rule over white women, so to speak. Stadden constantly reminds her readers and her democratic allies that the enfranchisement of black men is merely the first step to male governance by inferiors. Racialized men, she says, are naturally sexist and misogynistic towards women. According to Stadden, the lowest classes of men are invariably the most hostile to the elevation of woman, as they have known her in ignorance and degradation and ever regarded her in the light of the slave. Implying that the conditions of women under black and non-white men-read uncivilized cultures are worse than the actual slavery of whites is not unlike previous comments made by Stadden in trying to convince women of the ever-looming dangers associated with the black male vote. It was not so long ago, in 1865, that Stadden asked, have not male citizens been heard saying that they doubted the wisdom of extending the right to suffrage to women? Because the racial backwardness of black men is brutish, Stadden infers that the political empowering of black men would be another form of slavery for black women who were still actually enslaved. She writes, if 2 million of Southern black women are not secure in their right of person, property, wages, and children, their emancipation is but another form of slavery. In fact, it is better to be the slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant black one. Similar to her previous misandric renderings of black men, Stadden again restates the idea previously presented in her letters on the pages of the Revolution as an equivocation between the institution of American chattel slavery and a black woman's marriage to a black man. In her testimony over the 15th Amendment, Phoebe Cousins reiterates Stadden's views of black men. She says, I have had opportunities of seeing and knowing the condition of both sexes and will bear my testimony that black women are and always have been in a far worse condition than black men. As a class, they are better and more intelligent than men, yet they've been subjected to greater brutalities while compelled to perform exactly the same type of labor as men toiling by their sides in the fields. The black men as a class are very tyrannical in their families. They have learned the lesson of brute force but too well. And as the marriage law allows the husband entire control of his wife's earnings and her children, she is in worse bondage than before. Because in many cases, the task of providing for helpless children and an idle, lazy husband is imposed on the patient wife and mother. And with this sudden elevation of citizenship, which the mass of stupid, ignorant Negroes look upon as entitling them to great honor, I regard the future of the state of the Negro woman without ballot in her hand as deplorable. Now, there are several instructive moments in Cousins' statements concerning black men. For instance, while she articulates that black women are better off as a class, insofar as black women are thought to be more intelligent and just as hardworking as black men, the position of black women as a group are endangered because of the dangers and violence threatened by black men. Black men are tyrannical and violent within their families, according to Cousins. Because they were brutalized in slavery, they somehow took that violence, became socialized in it, such that any attempt to marry them is how violence will be present when they rule their homes. Again, reiterating the relationship between chattel slavery and marriage, Cousins suggests that, like slave masters, black men rob black women of their earnings. Black women are then forced to take care of helpless children and lazy husbands. Like much of the intersectional discourse of our present day, black women are framed as being burdened by racism and sexism. However, an important distinction must be raised. Because there was no idea of woman as oppressed as a class, as simply because of their sex and the effects of patriarchy, womanhood was framed as that of mother, often within the sphere of the home. In this case, the black woman is oppressed because of her race and the abuse she receives at the hands of black men. There is great similarity between the aforementioned statements and Sojourner Truth's celebrated statement in the first inaugural American Equal Rights Association meeting in 1867. Now, lots of people like to quote this statement, but listen to the whole quote. There's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So I am for keeping the thing going while things are stirring, because if we wait till it is still, it will take a great while to get it going again. White women are a great deal smarter and know more than colored women, while colored women do not know scarcely anything. They go about washing, which is about as high as a colored woman gets, and their men go about idle. End quote. While Paula Giddings has suggested that Sojourner Truth was the victim of the brutish conditions of slavery and took on both the misrepresentations of black men and the supposed inferiority of black women to white women, what if her statement says something more fundamental about the relationship of feminism to black men? Could Truth not in fact be articulating the script of the movement that she in fact sees herself very much part in? While Elise Johnson McDougall writes, in this matter of sexual equality, Negro women have contributed few outstanding militants, a notable instance being the historic Sojourner Truth. On the whole, the Negro women's feminist efforts are directed chiefly towards the realization of equality of the races, the sex struggle assuming the subordinate place. Perhaps she was articulating the distinction between Truth's approach to the sex struggle and the larger efforts of black women's racial solidarity that did not demonize black males. Convincing the world of black men's antagonism to women's rights was the part of feminism's racist program. As Rosalind Turkborg Penn explains, despite the evidence that many blacks opposed anti-women's suffrage arguments, there is a popular view which says that blacks have been historically opposed to women's suffrage. Part of the investment in reacting to black male emancipation was to show that black men were less forward-thinking than white men and ultimately spelled doom for the Republic. In Women and Black Men, Stanton reiterated that the vote for the black men for manhood suffrage not only rouses women's prejudice against the Negro, but on the other hand, his contempt and hostility towards her as an equal. Turkborg Penn explained that negative reports about black male voters became consistent with the rhetoric of white suffrage leaders after the post-war Civil War years, especially among Southern suffragists who expeditiously attacked the black male electorate for failing to support the women's movements. Efforts to depict black men as threats to the unifying force of white supremacy, politically, and the intimate lives of women, both black and white, were popular throughout the South despite the growing prevalence of educated suffrage and its call to exclude black women from the ballot. So at the same time, you have white women acting to counteract black women's ability to vote. You have them nonetheless accusing black men of turning their backs on women's suffrage. Right? How do we make sense of that? The idea that you have an ever-expanding phobics of black men becoming synonymous with how feminism sees its role and its political duty to put white women in the political space. right? That's the question. That's what I'm fundamentally interested in. And this is something that has been clearly articulated. The expansion of white women into the public necessitated the death of black males. It was not a coincidence that throughout the South, when white women entered the public, the generative theories about black men from ethnologists and sexologists were that at puberty they become rapists, that they have the same sexuality as rhinos, that they had to be lynched or castrated. But we don't see the expansion of American democracy as an expansion of racial phobics. We see the expansion of American democracy as a dissolution of racial fears, right? That's what we call progress. But Bell Kearney says something different. She argues in 1903 that the South is a little bit behind. She says that the enfranchisement of women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy, honestly attained. I don't know how you honestly attain white supremacy, but that's the thought at that time. For upon unquestionable authority, it is stated that, quote, in every southern state but one, there are more educated women than all the illiterate voters, white and black, native and foreign combined. As you probably know, all the women in the South who can read and write, 10 out of every 11 are white. When it comes to the proportion of property between the races, that of the white outweighs that of the black immeasurably. The South is slow to grasp the great fact that the enfranchisement of women would settle the race question in politics, end quote. So when people like Kearney, who was an officer of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, wrote the essay on the South and women's rights, she was appealing to a certain tradition, a certain cultural trajectory. She wanted Anglo-Saxonism to rule forever. And this is a piece of the work that people like Louise Newman have done. This is a piece of the puzzle that we often don't see in our popular culture. That feminism is not the refutation of patriarchy, but in fact is perfection. Kearney writes, the white people of the North and South are children of the same heroic souls who laid the foundations of civil and religious liberty in this new world and built thereon this great republic. We call to you men and women across that invisible line that divides the sections, across the passage of deathless years, to unite with us in holding this mighty country safe for the habitation of Anglo-Saxons. Thank God the black man was freed. I wish for him all possible happiness and all possible progress, but not in encroachments upon the holy holies of the Anglo-Saxon race. So when white women would say that we must save white women, that we must take women's rights seriously, they are talking about the exclusion of black men from the public, not only in terms of participation, but in terms of existence. When Rebecca Latimer says that we'll lynch 1,000 Negroes a week if need be, right, to prevent rape, she's in fact talking about the kinds of fears that are generated by black men simply being in the same public square, participating in the same public as white women. Yet we see no relationship between this and the proxemics or space of that white women claim today. We simply suggest that these are accidents, that the 100-year legacy of white women suggesting that they're vulnerable to any male aggression, to the flipping of white men's natures as civilized to brutish, merely replacing the nature of white men with that of black men that they've argued and described for over 100 years, that these things are somehow accidental, right? The question of how we evaluate feminism is not whether or not it's good or bad, right? The question of how we evaluate feminism is the same way that we employ everyone to look at things like democracy or capitalism. But when you talk about feminism, because its subject is the white woman, her fragility and virtue overwhelms your interpretive senses. There is no critical thinking of the white woman. She is not depicted as the rapist and murderer that she is throughout history. You don't care whether or not she raped black men. You don't care that she cut the babies of black women out of their stomach. You don't care that she was brought to colonies and her presence set up segregational logics and literally created space so she's safe and didn't have to interact with the native. These are the problems that exist within a Western context of feminism. And unfortunately, we're too lulled into the sensibilities of its safety, of its rhetoric of equality by its popularity to question its origins. My view is that black men were ground zero in the resistance against imperialism. And part of that resistance was their resistance against feminism. It was a resistance against the joining of white men and white women to rule the rest of the darker races. When you look at the poetry of black men's burden societies, we look at the speeches of Frederick Douglass, He is very clear that the day for white supremacy is over, and he implicates white suffragists. When you get to the 20th century and look at citizens' councils and the ways in which white women were the most fervent advocates of segregation, claiming that the rights of womanhood and their daughters had to be protected, it was black men trying to beat down that ideology. In the 1960s, when they passed the Equal Rights Amendment and were arguing that they could kill Title VII with sex by introducing it as a category, it was black people refuting that attempt. Those debates are about white women having the right to sue over black women. But we don't see that under our general guides of intersectionality. We don't see that in our general impulse for equality. The equality that white women envisioned for over 150 years was strictly aligned to white supremacy. And that is not a descriptive phenomenon. They wanted to dominate the world. And in doing that, black men and black women were right there to stop them. Thank you.
So first off, I want to say thank you everyone for coming here. I'm glad to be back at my alma mater. I haven't been back for like 4 years. So I'm glad I actually had an excuse to see the campus. And I want to thank Roger, let's call you Mr. Williams. I like it, make you professional. But in terms of Tom McCurry's work, I brought The Man Not, which is a book I reviewed for the APA on black issues in philosophy. But I think it has a very intimate connection to the actual presentation that Tommy gave today. So I'm just going to offer a couple questions to have a conversation with Tommy, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor and gather some questions. So the first question that I wanted to actually have us think about, and Tommy, you did a good job at the end of your talk, when you talked about the Republican Democratic parties, talking about really what if we think of the suffrage movement, not as a movement for equality, but in terms of racial backlash, as really co-ownership, co-rulership, co-governance. How can we take that historical lessons from the 19th century today? So the question I wanted to pose to you is, really, how can we think of this suffragist movement, this feminism or white feminism as you term it, as being operative today in certain logic, especially dealing with our past presidential election?
Right. So, I think everyone was somehow shocked, but shouldn't have been, when white women voted for Trump overwhelmingly. And that's largely because people aren't very good historical thinkers and theorists. When you look at the historical trajectory, and Dr. Jordan really did a nice article on this recently, where she tracked white women's voting behavior throughout the 20th century. There had only been 2 times where white women had not, in majority, voted for conservative candidates. So if you were actually following what white women have done, even in the 20th century, we wouldn't be so shocked about the fact that they voted for an ethno-nationalist party. And I think that when you look at some of the history that I just gave and how it reflects on their constructions and conceptualizations of terms like man and woman, that you can see that there is a real ethno-nationalist appeal that racism has to feminists. I tell people constantly that when Donald Trump made the argument that we have a bunch of Mexicans that are coming over to America and raping women, that he was not engaged in racial politics, he was engaged in gender politics. And the reason for that is that historically, even at the turn of the century with the white peril, the yellow perils, the black peril, the most coalescing political threat to white women has been that of the foreign rapist. So you see multiple discourses, multiple scientific explanations popping up around the 1900s, in the 19-teens, 1920s, trying to explain why white women had to protect themselves from foreign invaders, both culturally and physically and biologically. So when you look at Donald Trump's arguments about Muslims, it appeals to a certain ethno-theological basis of how white women saw themselves as the wombs and guardians of white civilization. The same way that they were worried about Jews at the turn of the century and the Irish coming into America and white women formed WKKK organizations is a similar faculty that's happening when Donald Trump is identifying Muslims not only as political threats, but cultural threats to America's Christian nation. That feminism, that historical conscience and positionality that white women have played within the building of empire is what allows that sensibility to constantly reemerge. So when you see white women supporting Trump, despite his actual misogyny, despite his actual incompetence, it's appealing to something that's much richer and historically situated in how white women have interacted with racial groups. We don't often think of white women as racist, right? We don't think of white women as rapists. We don't think of white women as colonizers. So when we see white women doing something, despite the fact that this is what they've done for most of the 20th century, somehow we're shocked. And that tells me that there's an epistemic problem, that you can see 150 years of white women's activism activity that's building up racial constructions of alien males, otherized males, subjugated and lower order males. And we pay no attention to it. We can see white women vote for conservative candidates overwhelmingly. We pay no attention to it. We somehow keep arguing about whether or not they're the right intersectional coalitional partners because we're not looking at evidence. And then when we're put in a situation that we're confronted with the racism of white women, for someone like Trump, where the racism of white women is now situating neo-fascism and a Klan audience on the streets. I'm at A&M, so they're recruiting people, right? Under the rubric of keeping white womanhood safe, which is why they say we need concealed carry. There are student organizations that have made this argument in print. We see no connection. When they're posting up flyers at the University of Utah with depictions of black men as rapists, creating diagrams saying that sex with black men for white women is uncomfortable because of the size of their penis, we see no connection to ethnological theories of sexologists from the turn of the century. And we remain shocked, right? So what I'm saying is that it's not just history. The history tells you about how they've constructed these terms and these ideas. And because we have bought into the idea that white women are virtuous, that they're peaceful, that they're morally good, right? The same arguments that Stanton was making about why they balance out patriarchy. We have missed this colonial legacy. We've missed the racial misandry, and we've missed the genocidal logics and tendencies that white women have historically had to preserve the white race.
Thank you. So I'm going to take questions afterwards, but I'll get to you, I promise. So the next question I wanted to pose is, because we're talking about the intersectional coalition of white women in terms of feminism, in terms of equality, one thing I wanted to bring up is when we're talking about the genre of black manhood or gender politics, one thing I wanted to hear more about is that in your book and in this talk, you talk about how in slavery, the notion of gender didn't exist for black men and women.
Right.
So when we're talking about feminism today, about equality between the sexes, how does this ethnological basis of gender really take into account? So
No,
what
that's
is
a
the
good question.
gender of black manhood even
Today. So that's a great question. I think let me explain something really quickly, because I know it's probably like, what do you mean gender didn't exist in the 19th century? Okay, terms change. Science evolves. It's just that because we're Americans, we generally don't think with historical sensibilities of things, right? And that's part of our culture. When you go to other countries, it's not like that, right? So because black people didn't have gender, and what I was talking about when Russet talks about, sexual egalitarianism was the mark of savagery. That's why people like Stanton in that quote, in that essay on manhood suffrage, is saying these are two distinct natures. Women bring about peace and they bring about judiciousness. Men bring about force. You have to combine this to push civilization forward. If you would say that there should be sexual equality in the 19th and early 20th century, people would say that you're trying to primitivize the white race. That's important because in the 20th century, the discourse that you get about equality is vastly different. In the 19th century, there is not a word that associates woman with a minority category. That term does not exist in the 19th century. The ideas of women in the 19th century are either as mother or synonymous with home or nation. That's what the term means. You can look at Horace Mann's the book, The Empire of the Mother, that actually talks about these distinctions and these meanings. In the mid-20th century, it changed. And here's what's funny about it. It changed because white sociologists start trying to figure out how could we make woman a minority class? And guess what they did? You have articles in the American Journal of Sociology. You have Avril Murdahl, who's, American Dilemma. His wife writes a piece called A Parallel Problem to the Negro Problem. And they're comparing the roles and situation of white women to black people, specifically black men. And it is literally, people, a chart. Black people, the Negro do this. We can say white women does that. So if black people, if the Negro is a minority category in class, we can now say the white woman is a minority category in class. It is that explicit in the intellectual literatures of America at the turn of the century. So when you ask the question, Well, what do we say about gender today? Gender has been hijacked to a certain extent. White women have always understood themselves as the producers and the generators of white supremacy. This is literally Charlotte Gilman's argument in the 1890s. They're the best patriarchs because they birth patriarchs. And they lay claim to this as part of their racial heritage. When that did not become the best way to do things because you have the tensions of the world wars, you now have a new situating of domestic language because empire is falling and being contested. Now white women want to seek out a minority category. And they use the particular experience of black people, specifically how black men are treated in this country, to formulate the idea that women are a class that are oppressed by patriarchs. When they first start talking about this, they actually use the word paternalism. And they're saying that the Negro and white women are victims of white men's paternalism. The only difference, says Murdahl, is that white women get to inherit the riches of the patriarch, of the white man, whereas the Negro does not. So they're comparing the plights the same. There is no patriarchy in the Negro class because they're an inferior class. But after you get the civil rights movement, after you get Title VII, we redefine things again. And now because black people are integrated, we want to make minute distinctions in identities. So we say, because Title VII used categories like sex, race, religion, orientation, etc., that those categories written into law somehow represent the categories that we need to look at all of history with. So one legislative moment in the history of America changed the way that we frame all of America. Because now we believe that religious orientation, sexual orientation, etc., are the categories that can be traced throughout history. Where before the 1950s, the idea of women that would be synonymous to the idea of gender or sex discrimination didn't even exist. So how do we deal with that? The reason we have so much tension with how we think of intersectional categories is because we don't have a clear delineation where one category begins and the other ends. So what we try to play this calculi where we're meshing things, they bleed together, right? And then we create silly concepts that say things like, well, gender is the division or disadvantage that women have to men because women are prone to sexual violence. They're vulnerable to it in womanhood. And we completely exclude all the rape that happened between Europeans visiting parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and throughout the Pacific Indian Ocean. We just forget that. And then we say, oh, let's argue about identity. Because we can't, the categories we use can't capture identity. They can't capture history, I'm sorry. So when you look at the way that we talk about gender today, right, it's really neurotic. Because we impress upon certain things, certain histories, that we have absolutely no record of. Up to the I'll give you a really good example of this. How many people have heard the term hypermasculinity? How many people have heard this term apply to black men constantly? All right. The term hypermasculinity is actually a social science term that originated around the 1960s and was used as late as I could tell till 1988 to describe black men. Here's the crazy thing about it. It's not a term that actually talks about black men being more masculine. It's about them being more feminine. The argument was, if black men didn't have male role models in their homes, right, because remember all black men abandoned their children back then. This is the Monahan type stuff. Women were the heads of household. If you had a son, the son imitates the head of household. So when a black son imitates a mother, he takes on female characteristics. They call it a female personality disorder. The effect of the female personality disorder is that the black man becomes more deviant. He likes female things, but his masculine body can't do that, can't perform that in the world. So he actually then starts to reject everything feminine. And by rejecting everything feminine, that's how he becomes hypermasculine. This is how this stuff developed. But how many of us knew that history? So what we do is this is what I'm saying. So we constantly deploy terms, especially on black male bodies, right? Because this is the history of how gender is formulated. In a patriarchal ethno-nationalist society, they're interested in the male subject because the male subject could have sex with the female subject and you mess up all your pretty Anglo-Saxonism. So everything is about policing that, right? Women are exploited for labor, for bodies, for generating middle classes. So when you look at Jamaica, you rape black women, what do? You create a middle class of people, mulattoes, that could do your dirty work and govern over the rest. See, our bodies are exploited in different ways. Our sex makes us vulnerable in different ways. But we know none of this, so then we come in and we start talking about the ideas of patriarchy. Black men were literally excluded from the patriarchal class in this country until the 70s. There is not a record in 100 years of anyone referring to black men as patriarchs, because the idea was that they were lesser men and feminine. This is what they said in the 19th century ethnology. This is what they said in the 20th century. This is what they said in the 1980s. But then you get the birth of different kinds of feminism. Now feminism's on the rise because it's counteracting the civil rights movement. White women want a piece of this pie. And somehow after 100 years of black men being effeminate, savage people that are like cherub white children or white girls, they automatically become patriarchs. And we don't know where this patriarchy comes from. If you look at Dorothy Height's report to the president in 1963, she said that one of the major agendas of black women politically was to affirm the manhood of black men and help them with their self-esteem because they felt like lesser men. That's 1963 in an actual report that was given to the president. If we take Michelle Wallace's book seriously, that means by 1979, black men were full-on patriarchs. That has to be the quickest evolution of patriarchy in the history of America, in the world. White patriarchy took centuries to build. Black men must be savants. But at the same time, after the civil rights movement, black men lose all their jobs. They lose all their political voice. They lose all their organizing. So that's why I say that if black men are patriarchs, they have to be the dumbest patriarchs in the history of the world. Because when you look at the generative aspects of white patriarchy, it created systems like the military, economics, foreign trade, imperialism, colonization, apartheid. That's what white patriarchy did. Hell, it gave you feminism. But black men could generate no such things in a 15, 20-year period, right? So what we've done is we've taken European concepts. We've taken things that literally have deep ethnological histories, and we've imposed them on certain populations. And now, because we're in the late 20th and 21st century, that's what we argue about. That's what we teach you as progressivism. Because if we start teaching you that white women were raping people in the colonies, we start teaching you that white women were claiming that they were more patriarchal than white men, we start teaching you that history, suddenly feminism doesn't look so alluring anymore. All right.
So now I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. So you can go first. And if you can speak up, please.
All right, this is going to be a little bit of a multi-layered question, so forgive me if it's not extremely clear. Due to the fact that European, specifically Western European, which end up allying with Eastern European governments later, is based off of the teachings from the Great Library, which they burned down in Egypt, that pretty much like fuels their systems of government, as well as the underlying fear that white people hold due to the fact that genetically speaking, like not racially speaking, but like pure genetics, as in like the Punnett square, if they mate with any colored race, the colored race ends up being the predominant trait. How then do white people essentially deal with the very minute and probably to some not even like consciously aware of the back thought of the fact that the very teachings that they are using to perpetuate this, for lack of a better word, fuckery.
That's apt.
How do they deal with the fact that let's see how I can actually word this. How would they deal with the fact if black people not only got their teachings back, but decided to go about reversing their entire process onto themselves?
Like killing white people.
You want to take 2 more?
Sure.
I'm just going to take 2 more.
Okay.
So I saw a hand in the back, and then you, man. Yeah.
I'm a little confused about talk as I reflect just a little over 10 years ago. We had a white woman running for president, and we had a black man running for president. And somehow the shift went to the black man. And so what I'm confused about as I listen to the talk, somehow what happened? I mean, why did not the white woman gather all these votes
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to
The black guy.
the black woman.
Okay.
So what shifted according to the rhetoric that I hear?
Sure.
tonight?
I'll be happy. Okay.
And the last question in the back.
I think a lot about suffrage, and I think a lot about like territorial suffrage
Mhm.
in terms of like, people in Guam and people in like Native American country, and I just wonder like what your thoughts are on like the continued like disenfranchisement of those people, and like if there seems to be any sort of like, historical thread to like the current like exclusion of Puerto Rican.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a lot of things that are not very interesting.
Okay. Thank you. So to the first question. So white people have historically been a racist and xenophobic group. Many of the ways that white people influenced that, and this was actually a debate at the turn of the century, was a question of like the Britain model, pure force and accumulation of land, where people largely were owned by Britain and lands were owned by Britain, but people still had their culture. And a turn of the century theory by people like Josiah Royce. This is why I'm so interested in his work, where the idea was that to better rule people, you had to take away their culture. That speaks to kind of the model you're speaking to. So when you're talking about the great libraries, when you're talking about Alexander, the conquering of antiquity, you're looking at an imperial model where all knowledge and everything was centralized with Europe or back then Greece, right? So I think they wouldn't be happy about it, of course. But I think the system is now set up so that there will never be what Fanon called a national culture, so to speak, amongst black people. Because unlike white people who mystically trace everything to ancient Greece and anthropologically situate themselves on the use of reason, that's not necessarily how black people see themselves. They see themselves as particular entities within various European or global metropoles. So there is not the same kind of consciousness or sentiment that drives white supremacy between the United States and Australia and South Africa, et cetera, that you have with disparate black populations, even populations in Africa, right? To your question about Barack Obama, this is very interesting. Because what I would suggest is that throughout the various moments of the election, you can see Hillary Clinton using exactly the same language that I described in the talk. But you have to remember that whites are immensely sexist people, right? That white people don't generally like the destabilizing effect of liberal feminism. And that's so even when you look in the 1800s, like anti-suffrage movements, those were white people. Black people didn't have those. So what happened? Why did Hillary Clinton, who for a week was above Barack Obama, falter? I think that's because Barack Obama was able to de-racialize himself. There was a kind of de-racialization with Barack Obama, emphasizing his white mother, emphasizing his multiplicity, blaming, for instance, part of the economic crisis on the previous servitude or service of Hillary Clinton. And when you look at who was covered, right, and this was the big shift between Barack Obama and what we get with Trump. When you look at those white women, right, so you saw this especially in the second term, where they made the binders full of women thing that they were picking the Republicans for. You had educated, moderate white women who were able to justify in their minds not being racist by voting for a black person. So those college-educated women, but see, this is what I'm saying is important to pay attention to, because this is not deterministic. This is never wholesale. Look at the rhetoric. Barack Obama said that feminism is good economic policy. White women coming out of college 10 years ago said, I'm interested in economic policy. The shift of millennials, the way that liberal white women look at feminism is about capital and economic policy, right? So this appealed to a certain sensibility of how this group of people within the last 15, 20 years understood their relationship to actual political progress. The language, and this is an article that Gloria Steinem wrote about Hillary Clinton after she lost, where she was saying that Hillary Clinton appealed to this idea that finally we could get something ahead of black men. And she was disappointed because the world was not reading feminism as representation anymore. So that was the discourse. When Hillary Clinton said the world is not ready for a black president, right? That he's immature, that, right? This is the language she's using. She's appealing to the exact same thing the suffragists come. She just ended up in a period of time where a bubble had burst economically, and a large portion of white moderates, people don't want to talk, large portions of white moderates voted for Obama. 10 years later, that moderate class grew up, right? You're 21, now you're 31, you're 35. And somehow they see, wow, maybe now that I own a home, Maybe now that I'm thinking about this problem of immigration, now I'm thinking about this destabilization of Black Lives Matter, maybe Trump's a better buy. So the moderates that you had 10 years ago have switched over to more conservative. But notice that the discourse is the same, right? The only thing that happened when Hillary Clinton was running, and I remember this classic because I remember this part because I was laughing about it. When Barack Obama came up and he said, how do you offer me the VP when I'm winning? I'm first. I'm first. She's second. How is she gonna offer me the second position? And at that moment, you can see him kind of perform this idea, right? Subservient again. And this is why Steinem got so upset. This is why when Trump won, and I'll go a step further. This is why when Trump won, you see this huge celebration of ethno-nationalist feminists. And I talk about this on my Facebook all the time. The women who are supporting Trump are actually like the most long-standing feminist group. But you have liberal feminists, and there's a great book on this talking about conservatism and feminism, right? That the history of feminism has overwhelmingly been conservative. And you got liberal feminists. So what are liberal feminists doing? They put on their pink hats. And what do they push? Vulnerability. Sexual vulnerability to men. Now, if that ain't from the turn of the century playbook, I don't know what is, right? We cannot disconnect Me Too. So for 40 years, you're good. We're moving up. Jobs. Status, political representation. White women felt like they got some under Obama. Trump wins, it's all been an illusion. White men are rapists. Keep out these immigrants, right? It turns inward, right? That's what I'm saying. These dynamics are not deterministic. They're not already, predictive, but they're sure correlative. Look at how the same discourses constantly become revved up. Ethno-nationalists and white women are like, we have to preserve white civilization. I think there should be a genocide. I'm worried about the future of my progeny. They're outpopulated. Like, this is what's coming from the women on the right. Liberal women are like, everybody's gonna rape us. We're vulnerable. Don't touch me. Don't look at me. Don't say I'm beautiful. 2 times, that's sexual harassment, right? It's the same discourse about white female vulnerability that we're debating from the 1860s to now. And that's not to delegitimize it, but I'm saying look at the political consciousness and the repetition that you see white women enacting. Because they don't care about sisters that's in the inner city that get raped by cops. They don't care about black boys who are raped in the inner city in foster care or by their caretakers. See, it's not a true exploration of sexual assault. It's about white women. Because when you look at the motivations about sexual assault in poor black and brown communities, these things are largely related to types of structural and systemic violence. High rates of homicide, you're going to have sexual assault. You see the rape of women, you're going to see the rape of young black boys, right? Because these are structural conditions. With white men talking about, I'll give you a job in Hollywood if you sleep with me or I get to do other stuff, that's a white person issue. Black people don't own anything to have that much money to lure a woman into doing that kind of stuff for free, right? So it's a complete cultural shift on the power dynamics between that, right? Even when you get Cosby, right? And Cosby's a completely different issue. Don't put that on black men. That's Cosby, all right? But even when you get Cosby, look, I mean, it's done under the guise of entertainment, funniness, manipulation, intoxication, etc. Right? The propositions that we're talking about under Me Too, right? We're not talking about people who were, chemically induced and things like that. We're talking about exchanges for other things, coercion, right? And I think that's a huge distinction because the question of female vulnerability that white women are projecting publicly becomes a litmus test for how they want to see their relationship with men, nationally and more broadly, right? No problem. To the question about suffrage and disenfranchisement, look, I think that you see this all around the world. I just came back from a talk in California where I was talking about a scholar, she was dealing with Afro-Colombian identity and how certain constitutions recognize indigeneity and ethnicity, but not race. So I think that what you see throughout the world is still this debate on who should rule who. And I know that that's a different way of us looking at voting rights. When we tend to look at suffrage, we think of it as the expansion of a right to do something, to exercise a right to the ballot. We don't think of them as debates about the ruling of citizens or the capacity that certain groups of people have to rule over others. And I think that that's what's at stake when we're talking about colonial and post-colonial nations. Do certain groups of people, do black South Africans truly have the capacity to rule over themselves without white governance, right? We see this throughout the world in terms of post-colonies because the situation is very similar to what happened in the late 1800s. You know what Theodore Holly was J. Theodore Holly was talking about. The question is, do you believe that certain races are culpable of self-determining themselves such that they can form their own governments, their own representatives, and their own systems of knowledge and rule? I think for the 21st century, we don't fundamentally believe that. And I think that that's the relationship between the debates of suffrage in the 19th century and even today. If we get away from this idea that black men got the right to vote, hence they were privileged, because golly God knows why that's the case. They never got to exercise it, right? But if you believe that, then ask yourself, then why are all the people who are writing about suffrage in the 19th century not using the language of a privilege or right, but talking about the ignorance and intellectual capacity of black men now that they can vote and how that's going to ruin Western civilization? That's the fundamental colonial question. We've been so far removed from history that we've taken on rhetorics that don't even express what people were talking about. And that's what I'm trying to correct, right? How do we intervene in the categories and the concepts?
Thank you. So I saw at the last turn there's a question in the back.
I did? That's great. Thank you.
So I saw, Roger, you'll go second, but I saw this young man and then Roger.
Yes, sir.
So it's obvious that your assertions about feminism are heavily rooted in American history,
Mhm.
and from that, I would have to ask, how would you explain the kind of independent rise of feminist movements in other countries, or even if they're not independent rises, how would these kind of tactics of vulnerability against minorities work in more homogeneic areas like Japan or in Sweden?
Okay. That's a, oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, in the literatures, the history of feminism is largely traced among European countries. Now, there are people who retroactively name things that, like women's activism in India or, women's activism in Egypt as kinds of feminism. But in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of tracing the movement and influences, that's pretty much a European phenomenon. So I think I would say that there has to be a difference between female empowerment or what, Clenora Hudson Weems, for instance, says womanism, those kinds of terms and those kinds of historical incidences, and then the relationship that has to a historical account of feminism. And that's not to discount that, see, part of the problem is the term, like we think of everything women do as feminist, right? And I'm arguing that that's not the case. So when black women, like when I was reading Turkmore Penn and black women were arguing against white women over educated suffrage, that wasn't necessarily feminism. That's just the term we used to hold for women's empowerment. But these black women, these women in Africa, Oyewumi writes about this. They don't even have a word for gender the way that we do. So there's no way they could kind of buy into like the historical development of feminism in that way, right? There's not a surplus of capitalism in post-colonies. So I think we have to be careful. Like what I'm arguing for is nuance and specificity. I'm not arguing against the fact that women have done tremendous things across the world. I'll give you a really good example of this, right? So one of the things that I found frustrating but funny was that one of the first people to celebrate white women getting the right to vote was the KKK in this country, right? So their argument was just exactly what Kearney said. Now that white women have the vote, we could crush the Negro vote, right? That was 1920. In 1919, you start having the first incidents is the beginning of the Holocaust. Now here's what's funny to me about that, is that you have, this is Lauer's book, right? Hitler's Furies. She gives this awesome account of the way that Jewish women held on to the ideas of expanding freedom, women's rights, educated progressivism, etc. And German women became extremely ethno-nationalist, where they said that the purpose of woman was to reproduce Nazis. If we use the language of feminism, which one of those are feminist? See, both of them would have to be, unless you took some kind of view that says feminism is only a liberal progressive idea, which we know historically that's not true. So it becomes very difficult to say, well, whose feminism was good feminism? Because for a German woman who's a Nazi that says that, like Charlotte Gilman did in 1890, the ultimate role was to form and house culture. We are the progenitors of Nazism. I'm not defending Nazism, people. I got to say things like that. I am not defending Nazism. I'm not saying kill white people, right? This is part of the problem. But what we end up doing is we'll say, okay, Well, the Jewish or Polish case, well, that's feminism because it fits with our liberal values. That other stuff where they're claiming women's empowerment, building up civilization, preserving civilization, that's not feminism. That's racism. You see, so part of the reason that we can't see all these different movements and orientations is because the lens that we're looking to focus on says that feminism would be women's empowerment if it achieved our claim X. When the German women thought of themselves just as empowered because they deliberately gave up the right to vote because they associated that with Jewishness, right? So you see all these dynamics. You see in America the same thing happening. Black women are celebrating black men getting the right to vote. They're going to polls with them with guns to exercise this as a racial vote. Black women are voting in AME churches and then making sure black men are voting the way that they voted in churches. Like these are all ways and apparatus for us to understand the way that oppressed people have utilized certain kind of political technologies to their benefit. But under the guise of feminism, which focuses on women's empowerment, not cooperation, coalescence, etc., you don't even hear about the stuff that Elsa Barkley Brown's talking about in Richmond. So what is blinding us to all the activity that black women had? What's blinding us to what they did in the National Negro Conventions? What's blinding us to what they did in terms of in revolts in Africa? What's blinding us to what Indian women were doing during British colonization? Because we take a lens that says that it looks like X and we only look for female subjects. When if we're looking for actual activity of women, that's everywhere, right? It constrains history. And that's why Oyewumi is so suspicious of it. I think my situation is just kind of blunting in your face that white women are violent, right? My work traces how white women kill, rape, and mutilate people to build up colonies. So given that history, it's a very simple kind of line to be drawn there, right? And please this is not to say that there's not sexism amongst racialized men, that there's not violence, etc. But like I say, when you look at these things outside of that interpretive lens, you see things like the rape of men. You see things like men raping women in poor communities and women raping men in poor communities. You see the age of sexual debut being 17 for black women and the age for sexual debut being before the age of 14 for black men, right? These are structural and cultural problems that don't simply link to the imposition of one individual's patriarchal mindset over the other, right?
So, Roger?
Yeah. So
Yes,
thank
sir.
you. I have, you said you were interested in nuance, and there are times when I see the nuance and times when I hear large statements
Sure.
that sound unnuanced to me. So I'm going to try and, as far as I see, there's three things that at least strike me you're arguing.
Sure.
And I'd like to disambiguate them
Okay.
and see where they go. One is you're doing the job of bringing really close attention to the racialized imaginary of black men as it's emerged in maybe the United States, maybe outside the United States.
Sure.
You have to talk mostly about the United States. And that seems to me a really important project. The second is you've done some very interesting history that I don't know, so I have to defer to you about the early feminists and their use of that imaginary and their abuse of that imaginary in their political struggles. And then the third is the claim that feminism as a whole is an agent of white supremacy.
Sure.
Now that's the claim that it seems to me the least nuanced.
Sure.
I mean, it seems to me you've said, and I think it's very interesting, you said that the language of some of these feminists was not about equality, it was about something else. But there's a whole tradition of feminist language about equality that
Sure.
seems to be missing from the story you tell.
Sure. Sure.
So I'm wondering, A, how these three
Moments
that
for
I
sure.
point, you
Very good
feel,
question.
and then is there another story of feminism that we
Sure,
can tell?
sure.
And why not tell that as well? What's the politics of what you're trying to
Sure,
do
no
on
problem.
one side?
So just as a preface, most of that came out in Q&A, so that's why I'm, but so to the first question, you're absolutely right. I am interested in kind of the racial construction, what I call an anti-black misandric construction of masculinity, or what we call black masculinity, precisely because there's not very much research on the evolution of racialized men, alien men, et cetera, in the 19th century. Absolutely correct. Also correct on how white women are deploying this, especially in debates in the late 19th century, early 20th century. As to the third claim, my claim is not so much that there is not a rhetoric of it. So like when I was talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, right, in the 1970s, my claim is that the overarching tendency, if you will, of feminism from 1865 forward, before you get to civil rights, has been so closely associated with white supremacy and segregation that it's hard to disentangle that from pronouncement of equality. And I'll give you a very good example of what I mean by that. When we traditionally study the suffrage movement or women's rights generally in the United States, we traditionally teach classes that may start with Seneca Falls in 1848, move then to suffrage, right, because this is still first wave, move then to voting rights around 1920, which is second wave, the extension of the second wave up to civil rights, which begins the third wave, right? Abortion, right, abortion rights, things that representation, things like the Dworkin, McKinnon debates, things of that sort. Pornography, exactly, right? What we would take now to be a kind of liberal feminism, right? What happened to 1890 to before 1920? What happened to 1921 to 1950 before Brown v. Board? You see, those gaps are what I'm interested in. And when I look at those gaps, I start seeing citizens' councils. I start seeing the activism of WKKK, women KKK organizations, around the same language of women's rights. Now, does it mean that it's determinative? Absolutely not. I'm not saying that all feminism is that. But I'm saying that the trajectory that takes us to the liberal feminism that we're thinking of, right, with the issues of pornography, abortion, etc., have a deep root in these kinds of racialized trajectories. A great example of that would be the debates about abortion that had in the 1870s, where you had suffragettes arguing, for instance, that abortion was a faculty and practice of savage races, and that if white men gave them their political rights, they'd be more inclined to keep the surplus of white bodies up. So Beasley writes a really good article about this, talking about the debates of reproductive rights and how that was used to political leverage because of exactly what I'm saying. The value, the investment that white supremacy and patriarchy have in women's wombs, right? In 1890, when Charlotte Gilman is making these arguments about the economic dependence of women, her argument is that if you keep white women in the home, they become weak and fragile. They don't become good colonizers. And you need good colonizers to have good babies so that you can build up the colonizing ethos of the white stock. You see the same language in the 1920s with the KKK. You see this again in the Citizen Council in the 1940s. So that's the genealogy I'm interested in. Now, when you get to the 1970s, then I would ask this question. When Catherine McKinnon makes the argument that black men after the civil rights movement are still patriarchs now because they've claimed their manhood and that they're threats to women, specifically when she studies sexual harassment, where does that language come from? What is the intuitive assertion? What is the reality that drives McKinnon to start writing essays or at least make statements about sexual harassment law that says that when they're put in the same environment as white women, that they're a sexual threat to them? In the 1970s, given that before that they were segregated, they weren't even in the same environments, right? That's the reinvention of these kinds of tendencies. Again, not saying absolute, but I'm saying that even within the liberal equality tradition, you still have these remnants of racism that particularly target racialized men. And I think that you can see this in the coalescence between white feminism in the 1980s and some of the early writings of Bell Hooks and Michelle Wallace. Why start with the buck? Why start with the rape? The buck, right? The black buck. Michelle Wallace says that the only thing that survived slavery was the buck, right? Why start with these images? Because these images aren't apparent, right? These images come from a very long turn of the century rhetoric. So the language of equality that I think that white women give, as we've already seen from the work of black feminist intersectionality, is certainly classist. But what I argue is that their language is also racially misandric in the sense that even liberal feminism, under the equality rubric from the 70s forward to the 80s, has tried to maintain, and Angela Davis writes about this too when she's writing about the history of rape activism in the United States, still carries with it the myth of the black rapist, but even more so, the civilizational and democratic fear that foreign males have to a growing democratic republic. Sure.
It can't be only feminism that is
no.
to the black imaginary of the misandry
No.
male, right? It happened before feminism too.
Yeah, that's why I quoted all this stuff about ethnology. I'm saying that the ideas.
Focus on I'm just interested in the question of why feminism is the central part of your story.
Well,
or is it?
It depends which book you read, right? Like if you're reading The Man Not, it's mostly about ethnology and then how feminism takes on to that. In this project, the argument is about feminism because I'm really interested how we keep missing that. Right. So that's why notice I didn't start the paper just with like feminism. I said, look, here's what John Campbell said. Here's what these ethnologists said. Here's how the concept of man was developed from Adamic and Hebraic interpretations of the 21st verse of the Genesis, because those are what ethnologists are writing on. But notice how feminism, who claims to have an equality or egalitarian rhetoric in abolitionists, does not break with the ethnological views of manhood. It employs them, it deploys them for their own political ends. So and this is why I talk about the backlash. When Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw that universal suffrage was out of reach, they didn't say, well, let's try a more progressive venue. They started citing ethnologists. So that's my interest. Like the interest is not feminism created all evil things. But my issue is you have all this racism. Why are we extricating feminism from it? Why is it not a product of its time? Why is it not a product of its theories? Why are white women who employed the very same thoughts of segregation and rape, et cetera, not held accountable, right? So when I talk about Michelle Mitchell, and she says, look, well, I don't want to blame Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Well, I'm like, why not? If you're going to blame, if you're going to blame Cartwright or Van Every for establishing the kinds of ideology that leads to segregation in the 20th century, then why aren't you blaming Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was writing about it and socializing people in a national newspaper, right? Those are the kinds of exceptions that I'm interested in. Right.
Yeah. Is there one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question?
You want to ask?
Please.
I just think, because I'm thinking about this because I was in a class
Mhm.
by Christian Crouch here last semester about American history, and I'm just wondering what perspectives you have on these northern feminists who did embrace the ideals of Republican motherhood. Who
Oh, yeah.
Originally were kind of fighting against Andrew Jackson's
Mhm.
removal of Native Americans, and then lost, but then were really strong advocates for abolition of slavery.
Mhm.
And that seems like a well-documented history.
Oh yeah. So you're thinking about the abolitionists who were making arguments about the sacredness of the nation, the direction of God, things of this sort.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean that's their tradition. Yeah. So you could even put Childs in there. I think that would be fair. Look, I think again, I think that the example of republicanism, during the early 19th, late 18th century, is a very good example of kind of what I'm talking about in the relationship between women and motherhood and moral intuition. One of the arguments for suffrage that was advanced, at least in the mid 1800s, was that, and you can see these debates in the Lily, was that women were naturally more moral than men. That they were more, and for most part, y'all believe this stuff today. This is why y'all are drawn to like standpoint epistemology, and you trust women. Like there's no reason for that. It's the intuition of how you've constructed womanhood. You just think women are good, especially white women. So that's republicanism. The idea is that the women are natural teachers, and the reason they're natural teachers is because they're the first people to teach children. In the 1830s, when slavery was, you heard the term domestic slavery, right? So the idea of slavery as a domestic institution was actually a change from the way they thought about slavery in the 17th century. The 1700s, right? 18th century. It was put under the idea and the evolution of the white family. So who do you think was in charge of educating slaves? White women. Part of that is from the republicanism of the day. The idea was that slaves were a lower order of children. So white women managed the homes, and I write about this in chapter 1 of my book. They managed the homes, they assigned duties, religious teachings. These things were all coordinated through white women. The reason that history is never really told is because it implicates white women in a particular way. The kind of republicanism that you see with abolitionism isn't all roses. It involves a theory of the inferiority of the races, their childlike qualities, their ability to be more plastic, which means they can take on the culture or religious teachings, right, of women, of Christianity, of God, etc. And this was actually utilized in the very early part of the, early/late, 1870s, however you want to put that, when white women start coming up and start addressing the white woman's burden. It was that they were going to be mothers to darker races. There's actually a book entitled that talks about the role that white women had in colonization. So I think that republicanism and abolitionism and even Christianity, right, has a well-documented history of being against slavery. But the question is, how are they against slavery? People like Lincoln was against slavery, but simultaneously believed that black people should not be citizens of America, that they should be shipped off to Liberia. So when I talk about nuance and specificity, I'm talking about that complication, right? Yes, you have all kind of ideas of womanhood that have led to better things, right? But those better things also allow white women access to men, racialized men, that allowed them to rape them, that allowed them to abuse black boys, right, during slavery, to abuse, female slaves? Those questions have to be asked as well. Because if they're giving that kind of control and possession over the bodies of the enslaved, do we just assume that they were making them read the Bible every day? I mean, and I'm saying that seriously, right? What is the image that we have when we think of these white women in rooms, in private, with these naked enslaved black boys, right? And most of us don't think, oh, she probably raped them. Oh, she probably abused them. Oh, you don't think of that. There's no reason not to, given what we know throughout history, but you don't think that. But if you think about a white man next to a naked black slave girl, oh, of course he raped her. You see, that's the intuitionism of how you've constructed the category of woman. Has nothing to do with the actual case. Has nothing to do what may have been the daily practices on plantations or small southern farms. Has everything to do with what your interpretive lens and intuition tells you about where these people fit, because you're just reimagining it and you don't give them an evil character. So you say republicanism and these great mothers that wanted to educate and fight for democracy and bring the Bible to bear on the horrible, sinful activity of enslaving black people. And you don't look at what they were doing when they were trying to construct white motherhood, or what they were doing to exercise their moral authority, right? And that's all I'm trying to show is that, look, this stuff isn't really theoretical. It's kind of saying, how do the categories that we have mash up to what we know actually had throughout history? And for some reason, that's the most controversial thing that I ever do. Right? When I made the point about black people in self-defense that got me on the page of the Chronicle and everywhere else, that was a historical point. Black people have used guns to fight against white vigilantes and white supremacists. That's a fact. But to use that fact and say we can learn something from that, oh, God, no, you're advocating, right? And it's the same thing with feminism, right? And I take your point seriously, right? There is an equality language in feminism. That's why I said from starting off, you have to look at the genealogy, right? How these things are influencing each other. But that's not to say that white women don't have imperialistic ventures. I mean, the stuff they did in Puerto Rico to Puerto Rican prostitutes at the turn of the century in 1913, 1920 was crazy. It was Puerto Rican men that stepped in because you had other middle-class Puerto Rican women castigating these people as evil. And it was poor working-class Puerto Rican men coming in to defend them. Our history doesn't allow for such things because we associate men with patriarchy for no reason. There is not a biological connection to patriarchy. It is a cultural, economic, political system. But we're taught in liberal arts, if you're man, patriarch, male domination. When you look at attitudes, white men and white women are the most patriarchal group. If you want to test it with things like violence, white women are the second largest perpetrators of domestic violence in this country. But we don't have a problem with that because we don't associate that, right? We don't associate that with their character. And that's the problem, right? So we absolve them of every violence in the world. We take on their values and create this pristine image of the perfect white subject. Always vulnerable, always fragile, but beautiful nonetheless, right? That goes out and marches with pink hats. And we married that image all the way back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. People are putting pink hats on her tombstone. You see what I'm saying? You see the conflation of the time. And that's what's so dangerous, because that is what allows Trump to say things like, we have bad hombres who are raping white women. That's what allows people to go on college campuses saying, look at the black rapists. Where are the feminist groups that's outraged by that? See, that's what I'm saying. Where are the feminist groups that are outraged at the notion that innocent black men are raping women on college campuses? And that this racist paraphernalia, which mirrors the illustrations in the revolution and of the feminist literature, is racist. It doesn't exist. They've said nothing about this. Why? Right? And that's what I'm saying. I know the reason why, because you agree with it. Right? We have a long history that agrees with it. All right? But we don't say anything. So I guess I would say to your question like, yes and. Right? Yes and.
All right. And that is the end of our tough talk. Thank you so much.